All right. Hello again to all. Welcome to Katznelson Chapter 2. Um, this builds very much directly on Katznelson Chapter 1. I hope that you we'll put it that way, appreciate this book for what it is in comparative consideration of the Barber book, which is growing on me, but I still think reads a bit like a kid's book. The Katznelson text does not at all. However, there's a lot of overlap. I mean, I do appreciate that Barber definitely dives head first into capitalism, and which she distinguishes from socialism, which I beg to differ with, but her approach directly. But the two books are meshing together better than I had even anticipated. But so we know by the title of this chapter here, Katznelson Chapter 2, Capitalism and Democracy. The first chapter dealt with both, more so with democracy. This chapter deals with both, more so arguably with capitalism. Before I give you the textbook definition from, well, the Katznelson textbook definition, which hopefully you've read by now, what is capitalism? Were we doing this face to face, we would have an open floor, and I'd be writing things down on the whiteboard. Most people throw out things like what we learn, what little we learn about economics and capitalism in high school and even in elementary school. Supply and demand. We can think about control over means of production. We could talk about the importance of capital itself, money as investments. We could talk about labor, which is something that we don't, I think, consider enough when we talk about capitalism in the United States. But that usually comes up. The textbook here on page 33 defines capitalism as the system based on private ownership of the means of production. Privatization is obviously important, and private property, wage labor, and on production for the market, right? And for the market is the demand, right? So private owners provide the supply, ideally based on what we as consumers demand, right? Nothing wrong with that. And as a matter of fact, it's a system that has proven to be dynamic, productive, innovative, and efficient, right? I wouldn't be recording this on my wife's very pretty MacBook without capitalism, right? You wouldn't be watching this on your laptop or phone or what have you. I hope you're not watching this on a phone. That would make boring even worse. But anyway, we have nice things. We have fun things that we tell ourselves we can't live without, right? Thanks to capitalism. All the gadgets we have, and of course, all the things that we actually do need are produced overwhelmingly by the private market, right? Everything from toothpaste to toilet paper and so on and so forth. Capitalism amounts to another form of who gets what, when, and how. And if you'll recall, Barber, the AmGov book, gives us this definition of politics, right? Which goes back to the 1930s, I believe, as who gets what, when, and how. The deal here is, when we think about capitalism in this way, and when we think about democracy in this way, who gets what, when, and how, are we asking competing or complementary forms of the question, right? This is the crux of the text here, and what I want you to keep in the back of your mind, right? Because obviously, as Katznelson points out throughout this chapter too, there's a lot of overlap, right? Corporations, and thus capitalism broadly, makes a lot of decisions that have political impacts, right? That impact and affect our democratic system, right? So let's think about key decisions corporations make. And Katznelson is straight out of the text, right? Whether to invest, right? When markets don't look very stable, investors invest less, right? Fewer goods are produced. And that in turn can perpetuate more of an economic downturn, right? When things are going well, corporations tend to invest more and more and more, which helps things to go better and better and better until economies overheat and we see downturns. But whether to invest at all is ultimately a decision that private equity makes, corporations make, that can influence our daily lives, right? How about where to invest? Pretty important question. The fact that I'm now living here in San Antonio has everything to do with the fact that my wife first got a job down here, and she's working for a subsidiary of Toyota making transmissions. She's an engineer making transmissions in Cibolo, right? Why is there a subsidiary of Toyota, a plant in Cibolo? Well, I don't know the whole story, but I bet it has a lot to do with governmental decisions that incentivized the private company to build a plant there. Right? Again, nothing wrong with this. I'm happy to be here. I'm glad I'm here. My wife likes her job, etc. But our private decision on where to live was based on uh, decisions previously made by a corporation, right? Again, nothing wrong with this, but I don't think we think about this as much as we could or perhaps we should. How about what to invest in? You know, corporations obviously make things that we need, like the aforementioned toothpaste and toilet paper, but corporations can also choose to invest in things that really provide no good uh, for the consumer, right? We could think about everything from, fidget spinners to cigarettes, right? These are things that people have decided to buy for whatever reason that really have no practical purpose. But, other than that the consumer chooses to buy them, right? And that's also a consequence of decisions that corporations make. How about how production is organized? This is very important, but again, something that I don't think we think about as often as perhaps we should in this political system that we live in, particularly because we don't like to talk about things like labor unions or labor laws, etc. But I'll come back to this down the road. And I don't have that many slides. I think I only have 11 or so. So don't worry. I won't bog you down this time for as long as I have in the past. But I will come back to talking about labor unions and the regulation of labor in a minute. But corporations tend not to do things that are very favorable to labor unions or generally in the interest of labor at all, unless they're forced to by either unions and the strength of unified labor, or by laws, which are political decisions, right? So again, I'm not knocking corporations. They do nice things. They do things that I like. They do things that you like. But keep in mind that a lot of decisions that we make in our personal lives, whether we're aware of it or not, are often consequences of decisions made by entities with a lot more money than we have, right? Moving on here, what are some of the dilemmas of markets, right? One thing that to go back to the question, what is capitalism? It's inherently volatile, which we've seen in recent years, in the last decade and change. You've seen in your lifetime, whether you're aware of it or not, a massive downturn, economic downturn in 2008 and beyond, because of the housing market, housing bubble bursting. And that had everything to do with a deregulation of the banking industry in the 1990s and 2000s that led to an economic downturn. That was a conscious decision by political entities, or a consequence of political decisions made in Washington. Or we could look at the downturn that occurred at the kickoff of the virus crisis, right, in March of 2020. Less a consequence of political decisions made in the United States, but definitely an event that had an influence on the market, and the market tanked in the short term, right? So markets are inherently volatile. They go up, they go down, and it's hard to predict the cycles in capitalism, right? I mean, if we could predict them, we would all be investors and we would all be wealthy, because even if we started with a small amount of money, if we could predict these changes, we would invest accordingly, right? Unfortunately, in any capitalist system, there's a constant need to increase production and consumption, right? So economies that don't grow, capitalist economies that don't grow, enter into crisis, right? It disincentivizes investment. And this is a dilemma of the market, right? When let me give you another example here. Wealthy economies produce fewer children. Wealthier people have fewer children. This is just nearly a law in the social sciences, right? From theory to law, that as societies increase their wealth, their population growth slows. Well, increase in wealth is a result often, especially in a capitalist democracy, success of the system, but a consequence is slow population growth, which in turn is bad for the economy, right? Because the easiest way to assure continued growth of an economy is to have a growing population, right? So that's a dilemma of a capitalist market, right? Wealthier societies have fewer children. A slower growing population decreases the growth of your economy when, again, there's a constant need to increase production and consumption in a capitalist market. What about this? Finite resources and fragile ecosystems. Very much the case, right? There are natural resources that are inherently limited, right? Eventually, if we keep using oil as we do, it will run out. I don't know when that will be. And I'm not saying the sky is falling, that's going to happen tomorrow, but it will run out. And while we're using it, we're damaging the ecosystem, right? This is not up for debate. Scientists are well aware of this, right? So, while oil is intrinsically important to the economy of Texas, the wider economy of the United States, and globally, no doubt about it, our dependence on it is also harmful to the global ecosystem, right? So, again, we can't easily wean ourselves off something that is so important to the economy, but while we use it, and it will eventually run out, we're damaging the environment in the process. How about externalities, right? This is a term that if you're an econ major, I'm sure you've heard this term. It doesn't come up often in polite conversation, but it's a fancy word that is mentioned in the Katznelson text. But it's the consequences of a transaction between two parties on a third party that was not involved or maybe not even aware of the transaction between the first two parties. So let's say you got a paper company that makes paper, surprise, surprise, and it sells the paper to other companies that need paper to run their business. Well, what happens when you produce paper? Oftentimes, there are chemicals that are byproducts of the production of paper, and say without legal provisions to prevent a paper company from, say, dumping extra chemicals into a river, companies will do this, and that's an externality, right? Whatever pollution that ends up in a river, that pollution is there as a consequence of a private transaction between the paper company and the company buying the paper. But whatever damage that's a consequence of that chemical in the river, that's an externality, right? You want to go fishing and all the fish are dead. That's an externality, right? And that's a consequence of the market. And if markets aren't regulated, businesses will externalize everything possible, right? Because corporations aren't in existence to provide for the public good. They're in existence to make money for their investors, to make things that we want to buy, right? But we need to be mindful when externalities occur. How about the conflict between public interest and needs versus profits? Again, is it in the public interest to produce fidget spinners or cigarettes? Really, it isn't. But there are companies that still make these things because they're profitable, right? Maybe we as consumers should be more mindful about buying things that really aren't in our interest, or things we really don't need, and that would remove the profit margin, and then corporations wouldn't make such things. Who knows? But as it stands, we still buy things we don't really need, and that if there's a profit to be made, such goods will be produced, right? But this justifies an inherently undemocratic form of production, right? There is no democratic say uh, in what private companies produce, right? I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. I just want us to understand that our marketplace is not a consumer democracy, right? But we need to remind ourselves that it exists within a democratic polity, right? We spent the first three chapters of the AmGov book, the first chapter of the Katznelson book, talking about democracy, and less so about capitalism. But now that we're thinking more about capitalism first and then democracy, we need to understand that we have a consumer democracy that exists within a democracy, right? So the marketplace is inherently undemocratic, but it exists within a system, a political system that is meant to be democratic, right? So, there's a tension there. And out of this tension, or because of this tension, Katznelson tells us, and I don't disagree with him, that we see a structural advantage of business baked into the system in the United States. Businesses aren't mentioned in the Constitution, but they're inherently important to us. And they are so because business decisions are made privately but they have public and political implications, right? No doubt about this. This really, again, is not up for debate. And I'm not criticizing this. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I just want us to be aware of it, right? Business decisions are made privately, but have political implications. This quote I had in a previous PowerPoint because I've taught this textbook lots of times. I don't have a page number here for the life of me. I can't find this quote in the Katznelson text, but I'm certain it comes from it. Nonetheless, you can read this here, read along as I read it out loud. Because public functions in the market system rest in the hands of businessmen, it follows that jobs, prices, production, growth, the standard of living, and the economic security of everyone all rest in their hands, right? It's really difficult to disagree with this, yet let's remind ourselves every time that we find a threat to our standard of living or our economic security, we don't go running to business. We go running to the government, right? And when things take a turn, when we really see threats to our economic security, our standard of living decrease, we blame the government, right? We do, generally speaking. But again, we need to remind ourselves that government might have a role to play, but ultimately, economic downturns occur in the marketplace, right? And in a country like ours, where we claim to have a free market system, the government's not where we should direct our ire when things happen, right? However, government has a role to play, right? What is its role? Here's a quote from a politician whose name you would recognize. The government's role is to help create the conditions fertile for robust hiring in the private sector, right? Give you a guess. What politician made this statement? Drum roll here. It was Barack Obama in January of 2010, right? So despite whatever rhetoric that you might hear in certain media realms or from my uncle that Obama was somehow a socialist, it's both parties in this system, the Republicans and the Democrats, that take this view, right? It's really not that deniable. I mean, this is what it is. Democrats and Republicans, in different ways, different policy avenues sometimes, seek the same goal, right? To make sure that businesses hire people and unemployment, stays low, right? That is how, um, you know, again, our entire political system is created to work, right? How about this? Katznelson tells us, continuing on about this structural advantage of business, because society depends on what only capitalists can deliver, and capitalists will only deliver if they can make a profit, they enjoy a unique advantage in the political arena, right? Again, businesses, corporations, none of these are discussed in the Constitution, but they're very important to our day-to-day life, right? How do companies benefit from the political arena? In lots of ways, right? Land can be granted by governments to private businesses. Governments issue patents to protect intellectual property of businesses. Governments can impose tariffs, which are taxes on imports, which are often imposed to protect domestic production of manufactured goods. Tax breaks, which again is probably why my wife's employer came to Cibolo, Texas, and why my wife and I are now here. Research and development subsidies, vocational training, loan guarantees, military protection. I mean, businesses benefit from the military just as much as you and I do, right? And the security that's provided, the physical security that's provided. How about public education, right? I mean, you're enrolled at a public university for the purposes of getting a degree, for the purposes of getting a job, right? And the state of Texas has expanded. I mean, why A&M San Antonio exists, a very new university, because someone in the A&M system, and by extension the state of Texas, decided that it was in the interest of the state economically to produce more college graduates, because that's what the labor market demands, right? Again, not a bad thing. How about roads? How about airports? These benefit us as we drive around. They also benefit companies, right? And if you'll recall, I think the Barber text mentions, and I forget in which chapter, but there's only one privatized commercial, or sorry, only one privately owned commercial airport in the United States, and it's in Branson, Missouri, of all places. Me being from Kansas City, I've been to Branson lots of times. I don't really recommend it. I've never flown into Branson because it's a relatively short 3 hour drive from KC. But companies benefit from things that you and I pay for, right? With our taxes. Like, again, public education, roads, airports, military, and so on and so forth. Companies benefit from these too, right? No doubt about that. And these benefits at all levels of government attract private investment. And sometimes these benefits from the political arena often come at the detriment to political systems themselves, right? If companies or if states offer companies tax breaks, for example, right, that's less revenue for the state, at least initially, right? But this happens at all levels of government, federally, state level, locally, etc. Right? No doubt about it. And again, I'm not criticizing this. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I just want us to understand the political system, which is also an economic system in which we're operating here. Why do politicians sustain the structural power of businesses, right? Businesses don't elect politicians. Businesses don't vote. We do, right? But businesses do offer tax revenue to varying degrees. Politicians respond to electoral concerns, particularly their constituents' well-being, right? Constituents are the people that a given politician represents. And when constituents aren't happy, it's more and more likely that politicians don't get reelected, right? So again, when the economy is bad, we tend to blame government, not business. And politicians know this, and that's why politicians and businesses do work together to make sure that certain constituents are happy. And I said just a second ago, businesses don't vote, of course, but businesses can donate to campaigns, right? And businesses often do this because businesses want the people who make political decisions over them to be happy as well, right? So there we are, right? I'm personally not a big fan of the role of private financing of public campaigns, but that's another story for another day. And we'll talk about this in greater detail later on in the semester. Here we go. Can business interests be thwarted, right? The simple answer is indeed yes, right? Why is that? Well, businesses are not always aligned politically. And I think we're seeing this more and more after the summer of 2020 and beyond, that businesses, civil society, the public, at times almost demands businesses and corporations to take a stand on questions of, say, social justice, racial equality, these things that we're talking about more and more that we really haven't much in my lifetime until pretty recently. Businesses are coming to see that they're not always aligned politically, right? And this might have something to do with the owners of the business. It might have to do as well with businesses feeling the need to keep their consumers happy, right? But the fact of the matter is businesses aren't always in agreement, just like people, right? We're not always in agreement. Policymakers respond to many pressures, not just to big businesses, right? Politicians do actually listen to us, right? I can give you an example. I know this is ancient history for many of you, but in 2004, the presidential elections, George W. Bush won re-election, and he had flirted in the campaign, without going into really any detail, the need to reform the Social Security system in the United States, which is very public, right? And also very much in need of reform. I don't disagree with him there. But one thing that he decided to do once he was re-inaugurated for his second term was he proposed privatizing part of Social Security, right? So turning over, I think it was a modest 4% of what we pay in every month of our paychecks to the Social Security system, whether we like it or not, to then be handled by private investors. And the public, even people who had supported Bush, many people in the millions, stood up and said, do not do this, right? It's too risky. And I think we were proven to be right. I didn't think it was a good idea at the time. But 4 years later, we had the kickoff of the Great Recession. And think about all the billions of dollars that would have been lost in the Social Security system that really doesn't have a penny to spare had that been done. So that's just an example of policymakers responding to pressure from the public and not doing just what big businesses, in this case, big banks, wanted done, right? So politics and public opinion still matter, especially to those who are in elected office. To a lesser extent to private businesses, but clearly to politicians. So let's think about this. Katznelson uses this term private government, right? I don't know how well you agree with it. Reasonable people can disagree about this. I don't think that I'd stop short of going out and claiming, or much less insisting, that you agree with me that private corporations make all these political decisions. They really don't. But again, this is the build up to the chapter thus far. I mean, we can see that it's really undeniable that private economic interests definitely do shape our government to an extent, and our lives, whether we like it or not. But businesses are owned, this private government, if we accept the term as such, is owned by stockholders, right? People who have money invested in the stock market, which is to say money invested in publicly traded companies, right? Whether that's Coca-Cola or Ford or Hilton Hotels, you name the company, right? And that could be folks who have plenty of money to invest in individual stocks. It could be folks like me who don't have a lot of money, but through my employment over the years, money gets taken out of my paycheck and invested on my behalf, and that's meant to be my retirement account, right? But here's a nice little factoid for you. Again, this book is increasingly dated. It was published in 2014, so some of the references, I'm sure, feel rather old to you in 2007, to me, 2007 feels about like yesterday, but again, that's another story for another day. In 2007, the wealthiest 1% of all American households held 38% of all stocks, right? And the wealthiest 10% held 80% of all stock shares, right? So that's 10% of the wealthiest Americans holding 80% of all the stock shares. In contrast, the bottom four quintiles, a quintile is 20%, so 4 times 20, 80%, right? The bottom four quintiles of American households, 80% of all households, reported owning less than 10% of all stock. So let's return to our earlier observations. Businesses make decisions that influence us as individual citizens of the United States, right? These decisions are made in the interest of people who own stock. And it's the wealthiest 10% of our population that controls 80% of these publicly traded companies. Do you think decisions are always made with the public's best interest in mind? Obviously not, right? So you've got corporate boards making decisions that are in the interest of corporations. And there's not necessarily anything wrong with that, but look at the inequalities of who owns the stock, and then look at corporate boards themselves, right? Representation on corporate boards is worse than in Congress as society becomes more unequal, right? The text gives us some numbers about what was it, 3% of corporate executives are women of color. And granted, this is info in a book published in 2014, but my gut tells me that the numbers aren't that different today, right? And after we get through this chapter and we move into the next section of the course and start talking about Congress, I'll show you some data on representation in Congress. It's overwhelmingly white, overwhelmingly male, overwhelmingly old, overwhelmingly lawyers, right? And these are people making political decisions, but often making such decisions in the interest of private companies that are held by a small sliver of our society, right? You following? You connecting the dots? I hope you are, right? Decisions made both by government and by private companies are often made by those whose demographic makeup doesn't reflect the demographic makeup of the country. That's what I'm saying. What else to add here? Let's think about American corporate capitalism itself, right? All democracies draw the line between states and markets differently, right? That's spelled out in the Barber book. This is where there's some overlap. Barber talks about systems that lean more towards economic freedom, capitalism, and those that tend more towards state intervention in the economy, which she calls socialism, which really is communism. But again, different story for another day. And there's a whole spectrum in between. Where does the United States fit in? The United States government is smaller. And what we mean by this is fewer people work for the government at all levels in the United States than in similar democracies. The percentage of people who work for the government is smaller in the United States than in most other democracies around the world. And the US government is less intrusive in the economy than in similar wealthy democracies, right? The government is much more present in economic decisions in a lot of other countries than it is in the United States. Another point to make here is that its regulatory impact by the US government, its regulatory impact is comparatively light compared to other countries. An example, regulation of the workplace. There are a lot of laws, and I brought this up earlier on. There are a lot more laws in, say, pretty much the whole of Western Europe that protect workers' rights and workers' safety than exist in the United States, right? And that's just a fact. Labor unions are weak. And this is likely, the weak regulation of the workplace is a consequence of labor unions being weak, and inequality is the result, as Katznelson will tell you, right? Workers who are in unions tend to have better benefits, higher wages, more time off, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, you name it. But comparatively speaking, labor unions in the United States can do less and have smaller numbers than most of similar democracies around the world. Speaking of, I do like the Katznelson book because it gives a lot of comparative data, which I don't think it hurts us to look at now and again. This is figure 2.4 here from chapter 2, the top 1% share of national income, right? Comparing the mid-70s to around the year 2000. And again, I know this feels like forever ago, and Larson wasn't even around in the mid-70s, but if you look at the mid-70s, the wealthiest 1% of those in the United States earned about 8% of what was produced in that time period. Fast forward 25 years or so, and that nearly doubled, right? What's that? What are we saying here? The old adage, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And we can see that that's pretty clearly been the case in the United States. It's not unique to the United States, though. A lot of other, it's pretty much been the norm around the democratic world. The United Kingdom shows not quite the similar growth as the United States in the wealth of the 1%, but the trend is there, as is the case in New Zealand and even in Canada and Australia, even in a place that I tend to jump to the conclusion and think is really more of a social democracy with a lot more focus on equality than a free market. Even in Sweden, over that same time period, the rich gained ground, right? With Switzerland and the Netherlands and France being the only three countries, at least on this list, where we see this, right? Let's think about data that reflects inequality. You're probably not familiar, I'm assuming you're not, with the Gini coefficient, or the Gini index is sometimes called. I don't know what the GINI stands for, but it's an indicator, statistical indicator from the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, which is basically just a group of wealthy countries. Excuse me, I got the hiccups. That ranks inequality around the world, with 0 being complete equality, which really doesn't exist anywhere, and 1.0 being the most unequal that an economy could be. And you can see that that inequality across the democratic world, with the exception of France here and Belgium, all the countries in this list, and the United States even more so, increased the level of inequality between the mid-1980s and the late 2000s, right? So again, this is a consequence of political decisions we've made in the United States collectively, not you and me, but people who came before us. But we've inherited this system in which we have a democratic polity in which we're meant to be all legally equal, within which exists a capitalist system that perpetuates economic inequalities. Now, I'm not saying that we need to do something drastic to remove inequality. That's impossible. But at what point, and this is a question I'm going to come back to throughout the semester, I want you to keep it in your mind for now. And Katznelson doesn't ask it exactly, but again, it will come up in a film we're going to watch later in the semester. At what point is inequality too much for a democratic system, right? How do we reconcile increasing levels of inequality in a system that's meant to be equal for all, right? Politically, when politics and economics are inherently entwined, right? That's all. I'll leave you. I'll leave you with that. I don't want to repeat myself any more than I already have, but things to think about, right? I hope. Even if you disagree with the Katznelson text, which you're free to do, I don't love the Barber book. I don't disagree with it that much per se, but I can't please everybody. But I hope these two texts in tandem are at least getting you to think about the political world around you more so than you have prior, right? But that's my last slide. I'm done for today. We will be in touch. See you soon.